Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Beyond Talking Points with Matt and Matt. For about 2 weeks, for various reasons, we had to take a break, but we're going to get back into the swing of things. And today, we wanted to just give a kind of a brief overview of where politics is going right now. Of course, we recently just well, it keeps dragging on, but the presidential election happened very recently. There's been a lot of talk about it because it's actually been a pretty interesting election. In some ways, the mainstream predictions or interpretations, you could say maybe they were vindicated at some level. In other ways, they were contradicted. Matt and I were having a conversation over text a week or so ago about the whole thing, and we just wanted to explore sort of what we think is going to happen in the next 2 to 4 years. What do we expect from a Biden presidency? Are we optimistic? Are we pessimistic? So I'll just gonna kind of start with a few thoughts I had, and then Matt can riff off of those, and we'll go from there. My general prediction, and I didn't have like any special knowledge. I was just I was reasoning from a few bits of intuition and pieces of information that I had. But I was reasoning that Joe Biden was going to win the election, and I reasoned that because we're in the middle of a pandemic, we're in the middle of a great recession. Whether you agree or disagree, a lot of people are very unhappy, very upset, very confused. And what happens often is if there's crazy events going on under the watch of a particular president, generally that president gets blamed. So I figured that would be part of it. A few weeks before the election, Biden was up like 16 percentage points in the polls. Now, the polls, we'll get into that in more detail, of course, but I thought that was a good lead. And then another aspect, of course, was the question of like how someone votes based on their politics, basically. And so there's some evidence that if you're more left-leaning, more Democrat, you were more likely to vote by mail, and if you were Republican, you were more likely to vote in person. So someone, I don't know who came up with this term, but there was the term, the Red Mirage, the idea that on election day, it would look like Trump was winning because all the in-person ballots were being counted. And then as the mail-in ballots trickled in, it would show that, in fact, Joe Biden was in the lead. None of this is controversial. Most of this is mainstream analysis, some of which I agree with, some of which I disagree with. But I think that's a good introduction to the topic. So I will let my co-host jump in here.
Yeah, I thought it was going to be an interesting election. So to give some inside baseball, off air a month or two ago, we wagered a little bit on the election. I don't remember if the odds were for where Trump, it was a 1-4 or 1-5 Trump Biden, but I know I lost $10 assuming Trump doesn't prove some miraculous, he pulls like a million votes across several states. But the way I saw it was a lot of people were giving Trump very, very low odds. And I was thinking, well, I don't think he'll win, but I'd happily take 1-4 odds. I thought there was probably close to like a 40 or 50% chance he'd win. And I listened to a lot of 538 podcasts. That's like with Nate Silver and all of them doing election analytics. And they've kind of debriefed from the election, saying that their model wasn't wrong, but it's kind of weird how they justify it, because a lot of the polls were clearly wrong, but they give Trump things like the incumbent advantage and things like that to offset the polls a little bit. So they kind of said, well, we still gave him a chance, and he did have a chance. So in the end, I think it was a pretty close race, assuming that what we know now is final and confirmed. And it swung towards Biden. Now, I'm really hesitant, and this is kind of something I always touch on when it comes to big events like this, of ascribing sweeping narratives to anything. So there's historically been an incumbent advantage. We know our country is very polarized. we know a lot of people hate Trump, but we also know a lot of people hate the left. So that's like, it's really just most people who voted because they hate the other party. And then there are a lot of people who are overwhelmingly enthusiastic for Trump. So if Trump's base is smaller, he might drive out voter turnout at a higher proportion. So I was kind of saying, there's all these factors, and there's also, as I talked to you about earlier, I heard this on the Dispatch. They kind of did a breakdown about how about 3% of new mail-in voters usually get their ballots thrown out because they usually fill out things incorrectly because they don't really know what they're doing. And a lot of people have trouble following relatively basic instructions because nobody really likes to read things. We all do that all the time. Like if I got something in the mail and it had like 3 pages of boring text, think I'm going to read it before I just flip to the filling in the bubbles. It's like I probably flip to filling in the bubbles, and if you don't sign at the right spot, your ballot get thrown out. So I thought because Democrats were going to overwhelmingly vote by mail, there was more of a chance that more percentage of their votes got thrown out, and that would also could potentially offset in Trump's favor, especially in close states. So there was just so many variables that I thought it was kind of a toss-up, or predicting is kind of pointless unless you can quantify each of these things. That's kind of where I was at. And that's why I was, Matt jokingly was kind of texting me saying things that he's like, I was right all along, this and that. And I was all upset because I didn't know he was joking. But it's not uncommon to see these pundits on TV essentially saying that Biden won, therefore every notion that Trump has ever stood for has been repudiated by voters. You know, it's like, oh, Joe Biden won a historic turnout. 80 million people voted for Joe Biden. Therefore, we have a mandate to push forward a policy agenda that is similar to what Joe Biden supports. And all these things are happening, even though it's like a very small amount of votes in several states are going to decide the election. But then it turns into that's the will of the people. So it's kind of funny to see how that's playing out, given, I guess, all the confounding factors. That's my overall observation about the actual election itself. And I do think there's like not a negligible chance that a ton of like really bad things happened involving voter misconduct, mostly because I think that stuff could very easily happen. I think it happened in the past in like 2000 and 2004. So I'm skeptical of it, but I think proving it in court is going to be impossible if anything did happen. And it's hard to get proof of those things that's verifiable, even if something did happen. So chasing that dog is like a lost cause. So I find it very, very, very unlikely that anything will get overturned in the coming weeks. So that's where I stand on, I guess, like 10 different aspects of the election.
So the interesting thing to me so far about this election is I think that it was a bit more of a toss-up than perhaps I and many other people thought. And just the fact that the race was so close illustrates that. I was leaning towards the idea that it would be a pretty solid victory, a pretty sweeping victory. And then, if you go by the popular vote, it was a pretty comfortable victory by Biden. Was it did he win by 4 million votes, or I don't remember the exact number, but something to that effect. But even so, the victory was by no means by no means a situation where he just got pretty much all the votes and Trump got basically nothing. It was like it was a situation where it was about 3 or 4 percentage points away, or 3 to 4 percentage points difference between the two. And I think that was not something that I expected. That it shows that even if people like myself, who pretty much despise the man we call Donald Trump, it shows that despite all his flaws, or all the reasons that I disagree with him or think he's a terrible president, there are still quite a few people out there that would get behind him at some level, or say, well, I'd rather vote for him than vote for Biden. The thing that really, I guess, is surprising to me, and this probably isn't as surprising to you as it is to me, the the pollsters underestimated Trump for the second time. Now that they got the last in 2016 they got the guess wrong for in terms of who won the presidential election. This time they did get their guess or their estimation was correct, but the numbers were way off. People thought that Joe Biden was going to get way more electoral votes than he did. People thought, as I did, that it was going to be more of a sweeping victory than it was. I don't know. I don't know if this is a problem with polling or pollsters. I don't know if this is a kind of a cultural problem or a issue with certain kinds of attitudes or certain presuppositions or intuitions that people have that they aren't questioning. But I think it is something we need to think about. Why does Trump overperform, and why did Biden underperform? And I think I have some thoughts in that regard, and many people do as well. But it's important to point it out in the first place. It was not, as I said, the election was closer than I thought it would be. Even if my general prediction was even if my prediction of who would win the presidency was correct, it was a tighter race than I thought it would be. And I realize, as you said, you don't like sweeping statements, but I'm sure that there are things you could say about the country right now as a whole, that, or you could make certain observations or certain general statements based on how people voted in this election.
Yeah, I almost think there's not a lot to take away from the election as it stands. Like that there aren't, because it was in a way so close. Like if you look at the popular vote, it's going to be for a while, Democrats are always going to win. And a lot of that reason is because of how much they run up the numbers in California. But if you took away like California in 2016 altogether, if you took away for their votes for both candidates, then Trump would have won the popular vote in 2016. And I don't say that because like I don't say that because I think California should be ignored. I'm more saying that because I didn't know that at all, and I found that surprising when I found it out. So it's like I even when the popular vote is run up, a lot of that, if you just exclude California, it's like really close, you know? So, and if you exclude California, which is like clearly overwhelmingly like left wing in terms of the voters, at least, because a lot of Republicans there just don't bother voting because it's a solidly blue place, you end up with like a 50-50 country when it comes to it. And then a lot of regions from county to county are vastly polarized. So like I just am hesitant to make generalizations about like how America has shifted in any kind of tangible way when a lot of counties just got like further blue or further red, or some types of counties slightly changed, but they only changed on the margin, but the margin is enough to swing an election. It's like, okay, so 10% of people in one type of county all around the nation changed their mind, so 1 out of 10 people changed. That's not a repudiation of America, right? That's 1 out of 10 people change their mind, and that swings an election because elections are close. But so that's why I'm hesitant to bring up narratives. Now, what you're saying about polling, I do agree that it's clearly wrong. I think it's actually a lot more wrong this year than it was in 2016, even though Trump lost. Because in 2016, a lot of the state polls were actually kind of they were kind of accurate, right? So if you looked at the state polls, Trump was actually polling pretty well in all the states he ended up winning. Like he was still underpolled, but not severely. And then the national poll was actually right in 2016 because Hillary did win by a few points. So she was always projected by like 4 or 5 points up, and she won the national vote by 4 or 5 points. Now this year was different in the sense that like people thought Mitch McConnell's race was going to be tight, and then he like blew out his challenger, and it wasn't even close. And a ton of people donated to try to compete with Mitch McConnell. And then there were some other similar cases like with Lindsey Graham, and then the Republican in I think Wisconsin was pulled down by like 16 points at one point, and she held that Republican held her seat. So the state polling was really bad this year too, and that's different. And a lot of this can be seen as Donald Trump has gone out there for 4 more years and openly fan the flames of we hate news reporters and the polls were wrong, which makes it more likely for no Republican to ever want to deal with pollsters. If a pollster called me, I'd probably I would not give them good information. And I'm not a likely voter, but if I was going to vote, I'd vote for whatever the right wing party is. So I would never be counted. And a lot of what they do is generalized based on certain characteristics of the person, like whether they went to college or not. But they're finding that it's hard for them to count non-college educated blue collar white men. But the thing is, a lot of the non-college educated blue collar white men that answered their phone were Biden supporters to a higher proportion than actually turned out. So maybe the non-college educated blue collar white men that support Trump would never answer polls, but the ones that are left wing in that same demographic group would. So they get an incorrect skew of that population because only some of them will actually talk to pollsters and the others won't. So then you get wrong numbers. So I'm curious how 2024 is going to pan out, assuming Trump doesn't win the Republican nomination in 2024. I'm assuming it's like a Nikki Haley. Imagine Nikki Haley versus Kamala Harris. I wonder how the polls would look versus the real results. But Donald Trump has definitely, sowed discord there. And it's I don't blame him. I wouldn't want to work with people who take results and then make generalizations about the world and what people believe based on, I guess, certain people's, groups or a small amount of evidence. I don't know how much more you want to talk about the election itself. Obviously, you can respond to that, but I do want to get to how we see things playing out once Biden's inaugurated.
Yeah, well, I was going to say one more, a few more things about the election. Then I was going to kind of go into more about, or kind of give the introduction or start the conversation about where we're going from here. And I'm going to do something that's potentially dangerous. I'm going to kind of give somewhat of a generalization, which you might not like, which is you can respond to or criticize if you like. But I think a certain amount. A certain generalization is justified in this sense. Donald Trump and Joe Biden, they represent basically two ways of functioning in the political arena, in a sense. So Joe Biden represents the status quo, just the traditional politician, tries not to offend too many people, tries to appeal to both sides. He describes himself as a centrist, someone who can work with the Republican Party. He's just your standard politician. And then Donald Trump, now, generally speaking, I would say most of his policies are pretty standard politician. But in terms of his rhetoric, in terms of his image, in terms of how he talks to people and how he engages with the world, he's a very atypical politician. So I think this election, it's similar. Well, this election and the election in 2016, they were really both about do we want the standard do we want a stereotypical politician, or do we want someone who's against everything, or do we want someone who conducts himself in such a way that is against what a stereotypical politician stands for? And what I find fascinating is people only prefer these the traditional politician, the stereotypical politician, slightly, ever so slightly. They preferred Joe Biden in the sense that he won, but they only preferred him just a little bit. They preferred him to the point where to get him into the White House, but they did not prefer him overwhelmingly. It was not a sweeping victory, like I said. But honestly, that is the most fitting kind of victory for someone like Joe Biden, just a middle of the road victory where in some ways you may not even call it a victory. And I know the Crystal Ball and Sager and Jetty from the Rising, they put out a video that said that this election, even though Trump lost, even though Trump lost, this election was a repudiation of the establishment. repudiation of neoliberalism, a repudiation of the status quo, and I think that's a good way to look at it. But would you like me to go into sort of where I see Joe Biden going from here? Would you like to respond to some of that first?
Yeah, I just have a couple quick thoughts. One is I've heard that narrative. I'm not like one of the problems with those narratives is it's kind of like how every day that the stock market either goes up or down, right? And every day that there are endless amounts of news that could affect stock prices. So you go on Bloomberg.com, and on Bloomberg.com there's a headline, and it says Dow goes down after news of, and then it's like a statement from the Federal Reserve in some random interview that was potentially benign. So it's like they've associated two things, and it's a narrative that makes sense, but really there's no way to show causal link. It just makes sense. It seems like a fitting narrative. So they put it up there and nobody really questions it. That's kind of how I feel about that narrative. Like, I'm like, yeah, it's plausible, but it's also plausible that America's like super polarized, and really anybody who is seen as a Democrat versus anybody who seems like anti-Democrat is going to be close to a 50-50 split, or a 45-49 split. I think that's kind of how I might see it, but I'm not like against that argument. I think it's a fair case. I think that's why Donald Trump won the primaries. I don't know if I'd expand that to the general, or I'd use it to explain some of his support, but then I'd be like, but what made Donald Trump competitive is he's not a Democrat, and a lot of people hate Democrats. So I mean, but either way, we're generalizing, and it's kind of hard to prove, and there's a lot of factors at play, right? So that's why I'm just hesitant. So I'm less saying you're wrong. I'm more saying I'm just skeptical of any narrative, and I would say that's a fine one. I'd put it in the box of potential ones. Now with the Sager and crystal ball thing, I think that's funny when all these statements come out about like how we should interpret it, like, oh, this is a repudiation of neoliberalism. It's like so many people who voted probably don't know what neoliberalism means. If you ask them, it's like people don't understand most policies, and a lot of people who think they understand policies are because they watch a little bit of cable news every day, right? Like the average voter who feels informed is like so uninformed on policies, and they probably can't give a steelman description of their opponent's policies position. So it's so funny that we interpret election results as like vast repudiations of an ideology that most voters probably can't even explain in like a 2-sentence answer. I just think that's funny. I mean, it's kind of true if you say, well, when I say they repudiated neoliberalism, I mean, it's workers who don't want to lose their jobs. And by the voters, I mean only voters in the swing states, because they're the ones who swing the elections. Then it's like, okay, that's fair. But it's like, do you think like that many like 19-year-olds in California know what neoliberalism means? It's like, no, because they're all going to be freshmen in college, and they just got a basic civics education, and they all voted for Joe Biden, and they don't know the difference between neoliberalism and like a lot of populist stuff. It's like only a few people will. Most people will have a slight interest phase and then kind of phase out. So it's just like, I don't know. When I hear that stuff from pundits, I kind of cringe. That's all I want to say.
I think a better way maybe to put it would be, and I actually didn't watch that video, by the way. I'm going solely on the title of that video, so I don't quite know what those two said in that video. But maybe a better way to put it would be people are... I mean, people are pretty, or the average person, let's say, generally speaking, is pretty discontent with the way things are. There are various reasons for that, and you can make various arguments for how we should tweak the system to make it more inclusive or more effective or more free, depending on what your priorities are. And this is also true for 2016, but as far as I know, the situation really hasn't improved. As you say, the country's very polarized. People's basic worldviews are in conflict, really. The worldview of a Trump supporter and a Biden supporter. I mean, there is overlap, but on many key issues, they're diametrically opposed. So the average person doesn't even necessarily need to know like the definition of neoliberalism to say, well, whatever this system is, I don't like it, and so I'm going to vote in such a way as to try to fight the system or try to get change the system in a way that I see as the way I see. They vote to change the system in the direction that they want to see it go.
Yeah, I agree with all that. I agree with that.
Alrighty. Shall I?
Yeah.
Picture. Let me paint a picture then of where I see the country going in the next couple years, and it's quite interesting. So I was having a conversation with a guy about Joe Biden, and I was bringing up. Okay, so Bernie Sanders in an interview with the PBS News, he said something that I thought was particularly stupid. He said Joe Biden will be the most progressive president since FDR. And the guy I was talking to, he said, no, Matthew, that's a perfectly legitimate statement. These things are all relative. If Joe Biden gets us a public option, that would be the most progressive piece of legislation since FDR. I bring that up as a springboard to just the conversation of like, well, what kind of president will Joe Biden be? And that is a question that, a lot of leftists, well, everyone's been having, but especially in leftist circles, because of course that goes back to the question of, well, do you vote for Joe Biden or do you not vote for Joe Biden? I was one of the people that did not vote for Joe Biden, but I knew a lot of leftists, left-leaning people that did vote for Joe Biden, and I respect their decision in that regard. But I really do not see... I do not see Joe Biden being the kind of person or the kind of politician who will make any sweeping changes to the status quo. He will continue. It will basically be like another 4 years of Obama. Now, of course, Obama and Biden aren't exactly the same. They differ on policies here and there, but generally their worldview is the same. So it's going to be like another 4 years of Obama or another 4 years of maybe Bill Clinton or Jimmy Carter or any like establishment Democrat you can name. It's just going to be 4 more years of that. Now, will the left push Joe Biden in a more progressive direction? I'm very doubtful. I'm very skeptical. It's possible. I hope we can make Joe Biden more progressive, or we can push him to enact progressive policies. But I really just don't. Based on his voting record, I don't see him moving in a very progressive direction. I don't even see. Now, someone might say, "Well, Matthew, Kamala Harris is more progressive than Biden, and she's going to push him in a greater or in a more progressive direction." And I think these are sort of wishful fantasies that many on the left are telling themselves. Like, okay, we got rid of Trump, and now we have a Democrat in the White House, and this Democrat is really going to change things. He's really going to push the country in the right direction. Again, I don't see that as happening. I think basically the difference between a Donald Trump and a Joe Biden is the speed at which they're driving the car towards the cliff. This is the metaphor that I came up with. I think they're both driving us towards a precipice, but Joe Biden is just driving us towards a precipice more slowly. I'm glad, or I am relieved to be rid of the orange man. But I am disappointed that a centrist neoliberal is in the White House, because again, I just don't see the changes that I want to see made getting done. I think that's a good. I think I'll let you jump in here.
So the most glaring, I guess, issue with what you said for me is that at no point did you talk about the relationship between the legislative branch and the executive, in the sense that you didn't factor that into what you think Joe Biden will do. And I think that is by far the most decisive factor. So say we had gotten the blowout situation where you actually have a majority of Democrats in the House and the Senate, and then Biden's president. Well, then I think somebody could argue that Joe Biden would do things to give you guys the single payer healthcare you want. You would still be skeptical. And we had that conversation a few months ago when we had a discussion about why I don't think Bernie and Biden are that different. Because I think that whatever the legislature gets them, they'll both sign, right? So I didn't think Biden would be as vocal about it, but I think Biden would pretty much sign whatever progressive legislation got in front of him. That's why I think the Biden presidency, especially for the 2020 through 2022 section, well, 2021 through 2022, is going to be purely based on the fact that they don't have a Democratic majority in the Senate. So any legislation that is remotely polarizing isn't going to get through both the House and the Senate, so it will never make it to Biden's desk in the first place. Then what it comes down to is how the 2022 midterms go. And because of that, I pretty much see there being gridlock through the first term of Biden's presidency, because normally the presidents lose in the midterms. So I less think it has to do with Biden's ideology, and I think it more has to do with the circumstances that the election has brought him. And I think that is the pivotal factor that's determining everything here. Because there's no way Sanders could get through single payer if he had this outcome, because the Republicans in the Senate aren't going to get it past the Senate, right? And the Democrats don't have control of it, so they wouldn't even be able to get it to Bernie's desk to sign. So I don't think that really matters at this point. It could arguably have mattered if it was a blowout, but it's not going to now. So now what it comes down to is what things is Biden willing to do as an executive order. I think that comes down to predictions about what's going to happen with Biden and if he's going to actually last 4 years, or if Kamala Harris will step in. Because if they're planning on doing Kamala Harris as the Democratic, nominee in 2024, then maybe they're going to pass a lot of kind of grandstanding executive orders, rolling back inconsequential Trump policies that weren't even really enforced, but they do it to kind of grandstand that they did all these things and rolled all these things back. And I'm not going to really care, in the sense that they probably weren't important or impactful. They're much smaller in terms of their scope. But they'll be used to keep culture wars inflamed and to keep division there. And that's going to play a factor in whatever the 2022 and 2024 elections are. That's how I see it. So I less care about Biden's character, because it doesn't matter, because he's not going to get progressive legislation put in front of him. Maybe Tulsi or Bernie would have pulled back people from wars, and you do still have a centrist neoliberal who's going to keep people in the Middle East. But that's like the main distinction, I guess, from what I'm seeing. I don't think I'm off base to see it that way.
Okay, so I was minimizing, or I was not speaking about the legislature in my opening remarks for a very specific reason. Am I saying that obstruction is not a factor? No, of course not. I would say there was obstruction under Obama, and it was the Republicans obstructing Obama from doing various things, and it was shameful and ridiculous. And I'm not going to. So I guess what I'm trying to say is there's plenty of blame to go around, and the Republicans are there's a lot of blame to lay on the Republicans. But I didn't bring up the legislature because the Democrats are just so bad at playing politics. The party is basically a farce at this point. They and this gets back to, as you say, the discussion we had about, is there a difference between a Bernie Sanders and a Joe Biden? Because the Democrats could get a lot more done if they knew how to play politics, if they were ruthless, if they actually had a spine, but they don't. They don't have a spine. They are they truly go along to get along, and most Democrats they don't have they're not willing to fight for their principles. They let it's as if the Democrats are a dog and the Republicans are the owner, and the Republicans consistently kick the dog, and the dog just takes it. I'm sorry, master. I'm sorry, master. I'll try to behave. um, as I might have said this before, but it's we basically have a one party system. The and it's the Republicans and Democrats, they differ a little bit here and there, at least on social issues. But they mostly agree on the general worldview. And when they disagree, the Democrats consistently give up and let the Republicans run all over them. And that really is one of my biggest issues with the Democratic Party, and one of the reasons why I'm very, I am not holding my breath. I'm not expecting Joe Biden. I'm not expecting much out of Joe Biden for that very reason.
Okay, so there's two things there, but one of them I'm just gonna not touch because that's too far of a hole to dig into. Now, what I'm going to say is, I'm mostly going to respond to the first thing of what you said, which is like about obstruction under Obama. Now, when you have like, so somebody could argue that the Democrat House has been obstructionist for the last 2 years since the midterms because they took the House and the Democrats don't want to forward Republican policies. So pretty much Obama had he had the legislative and the executive for his first 2 years, and then he lost it. He didn't do much in his first 2 years. So then, except for get Obamacare through. So then after that, Republicans were in power. If your party was in power in the legislative branch and your opposition was if the opposition was in power in the executive branch, you wouldn't pass the legislation that's going to get signed into law you don't like. Now that has been construed as obstruction when it's just, oh, I'm a Republican that doesn't like this Democrat policy, so I'm not going to let it go through with 50 votes because I don't want it passed. That's pretty much what they did for 6 years under Obama. And to some extent, I'm okay with that because it keeps big programs from not, coming into existence. But it's just kind of like, it's exactly what Democrats have done for the last 2 years when there was the blue wave in 2018. Right? So it's like now you have a blue house. It's like obviously they're not going to pass anything the Republicans in the Senate want. So the Republicans in the Senate are only going to do things that only the Senate has jurisdiction over. So they put forward a bunch of federal judges because that's what the Senate does. They didn't rely on the House to do anything. It doesn't have anything to do with ruthless politics. All it comes down to is ruthless politics can dictate an election, right? So if Democrats were more ruthless and voters liked that, then if there was 52 Democrats in the Senate right now, then you're right. Then, there'd be something for Biden to work with. But even if Bernie was president and all the Democrats turned their A game on and they're like, we're going to do everything in the book to get this passed, the Republicans go, no, there's 50 of us. There's 50 of us and you can't, or there's 51 of us, so you cannot get this through the Senate, so you can't get it through. So it's just like, I understand what you're saying. And I only disagree on the margins, but it's like, given where we are, it wouldn't matter how cutthroat they are because Republicans essentially have a veto. And it's not like there are ways to work around it. Arguably, they could get rid of if Democrats got a slim majority in the Senate, they would be able to get they could break down the legislative. What is the thing I'm thinking of? When people. I can't come up with the word for it right now. But essentially, how you need 60 votes to bring a piece of legislation through, so 40 can block it. The Democrats essentially said they'd knock down that rule if they got a majority, but they don't even have a majority. So it doesn't even matter. No matter how ruthless they were or if they were willing to break down institutional rules, they still couldn't get anything passed with 51 Republicans there. And that's what it's looking like the situation is right now. So in the end, I just don't think that's relevant to the 2021-2022 Biden cycle if we're looking at it narrowly. You could argue the reason Trump got in is because he seemed like a ruthless person who was going to do everything he could to fight for the people, and that won him the presidency. That could be argued. So Democrats could do better if they portrayed that image and were more cutthroat. But given the actual election results, it doesn't matter how they play it. It's just they have a veto. So if Bernie was president with the same amount of people in the House and Senate, it wouldn't matter. It's just not getting to him.
I think I mostly agree with your statement and exactly or completely disagree with the very last statement you just made. But I don't know if we want to go down that rabbit hole
Well,
exactly.
I think we might want to, because if you somehow think if there are 51 Republicans in the Senate, Bernie would still be able to get single payer through, then you need to open my mind to that, because I just don't know how he'd get 51 Republicans and he'd get Republicans to jump on board with progressive agenda. It's just like, no, you can't, even if you broke out rules that like Biden would generally leave instilled, it's like you can't get that past them.
I mean, well, let me make sure. We could be quibbling over words here, so that's why I'm not sure the rabbit hole is worth going down. But I'll try to rephrase what I'm saying or put it. I'll try to put it a bit differently. I think that there is a way to play politics, even if you're the minority, in which you get a heck of a lot done, and you can get key parts of your legislative agenda done. But again, you have to know how to play politics, and I just don't think most members, most Democratic politicians know how to play politics. The Republicans, they know how to play politics. It doesn't matter if they well, let me put it to you like this. So under Obama, for part of Obama's presidency, of course, the Democrats were the majority. That wasn't true for his entire presidency, of course. But even with a Democrat in the White House, I would say that the Republicans basically got out of him what they wanted, and they consistently blocked or prevented him from doing anything that strayed from their basic agenda. And again, this might just be a difference in our intuitions, but I truly see the Republican Party as the most influential party in this country. The Democratic Party is a wing of the Republican Party. Again, that's not to say there are no differences between the parties, but the Republican Party is the dominant party because they are single-minded about what they want, and the Democrats just aren't single-minded in that way.
What is the one thing they're single-minded that they want, though? Because if they're one issue, one mind, what is their principle?
Oh, I just mean they're single-minded in the sense that they will.
It's like a hive mind.
They continuously fight for their agenda, no matter what, and they never stray from that agenda. The Democrats consistently back down. If the Republicans can smear anything as socialist, the Democrats back down. Joe Biden has said multiple times he is against a single-payer healthcare system. If a single-payer healthcare system got on his desk, he said he would veto it. And I cannot help but believe that, or think that part of that has to do with the how much the Republican Party has influenced American politics. It's gotten to the point where it's gotten to the point where a single-payer healthcare system is a smear, rather than a policy which the majority of Americans want. It's gotten to the point where you can take what the majority of Americans want, and you can say that's evil, that's bad, that's wrong, that's socialism. If we do that, then we're going to be the next Soviet Union. Am I making myself any clearer? I don't expect you to agree, but I want to.
I would love to transcribe your monologue there and then do a whole episode where I like highlight and circle certain things and say, okay, you said this sentence, here's how I interpret it, here's why I think it's wrong. Now, I think the reason why I was actually commenting on the different part of your lecture, though, in the beginning, in the first part, where I was kind of saying, okay, I'm not going to touch the whole thing about playing politics as much as I can. I'm just going to talk about the fact that if a party doesn't like legislation and they control Congress, then that party will inevitably block that legislation so it won't get to the desk. And especially if it's big legislation, we know from 2010 through 2016, no big liberal stuff got through got through the Senate. So obviously, even if Bernie was in the same situation, if he wanted to put forward something, he'd just be Obama from 2014, given that even Obama in 2014, who was overwhelmingly popular, and the Congress was overwhelmingly unpopular, couldn't get anything through. Now, if we want to, so the stuff you were touching on is stuff that I have opinions on. That's just like another hour and a half episode, and it's less of disagreeing with you and more of going back to the very first conversation today and talking about sweeping narratives and a lot of funny observations I have that are relevant to your observation, and it's just things I've noticed, and then we would go down those rabbit holes. I guess I was trying to make a precise point, and I don't want to talk about the parties and how they relate and how disgusting they are, because I think that's just another box that we don't have time to unpack unless we're doing a 2-hour episode, which we're not. So yeah, I think we'll table that for at least the short term. Yeah. Now, the one thing I did want to say before we do wrap up is the result of Biden winning with a House that's Democrat and a Senate that is Republican is to some extent the best outcome possible for me. Because what normally happens when there's a Democrat president is Republicans pretend to be Tea Partiers, and then they care more about fiscal responsibility, and they fight over every dollar in the budget. So Biden does not get the honeymoon phase where he can, just like Obama did, have 2 years to cram through things that he likes that are big government before the uprising happens. And I foresee if the Republicans don't lose their 2022 majority in the Senate, that we're going to have 4 years of a stalemate. And although there will still be omnibus budgets that proliferate spending to some extent, it's not going to be huge programs. And that was the world I expected with Biden winning, or any Democrat having control of both the presidency and the legislative branch. So because of this, I think this is also, if Trump had won with a Republican Senate, then I think we'd have bigger spending than with Biden winning with Republican Senate, because now the Republicans have to cosplay as libertarians, because they have to pretend to be responsible now in order to be adversarial to Biden. So I think this actually, if you look at like the matrix of the 4 results, this quarter is the lowest spending option, and I think that's best. So I'm okay with that to some extent as a person who didn't vote and is just observing it. Obviously, it doesn't roll back government at all, but I guess it'll probably slower the pace than any other option. So that's my libertarian or anarchy-oriented or small government-oriented optimism, I guess, with the result. Although I do expect like a lot of executive orders that are, I guess, big government in the sense that they'll be bringing back regulations. So that's my official 2021-2022 outlook. If you want to give a quick, I guess, a wrap up on that before we sign off for the episode.
I think I've basically given my overview of what I think Biden's going to give, but I can say a little more before, as you say, before we wrap up. I'm fairly pessimistic, I guess you could say. I think best case scenario, Joe Biden puts forth a few progressive, a few pieces of progressive legislation that he somehow that the Democrats managed to get through, and then the rest of it is just going to be business as usual. It's going to be nothing special. Joe Biden will go in the history books as, oh, okay, one of those just regular old presidents, nothing too crazy, but nothing great, nothing awful necessarily. Just a middle of the road kind of president. I will, because I consider myself to be of the left, I will be very critical of Joe Biden in many specific ways. I'll give him credit where credit is due. I'm not one of those people. So some people on the left, they would say, okay, Trump and Biden, they're basically the same. There's no difference at all. And it's like, okay, maybe at a bigger at a big picture level, you could say, I could see where someone might say that, but when you get down to the specifics, that there are definitely differences. There are definitely differences. So you take the Iran or the situation with Iran. Our relations with Iran will be far better under a Joe Biden presidency than they ever would have been under a Trump presidency. Joe, and there are other examples where I would say Joe Biden is far preferable to Donald Trump. He will at least, if he doesn't try to pass a public option, he will at least maintain Obamacare, which, for all its flaws, was better than what previously. It's a better healthcare system than we had previously. He will try to preserve certain gains that Obama made. Obama was not a completely worthless president.
Do you think Joe Biden will? Okay, here's the last question. It's a fun bonus question. Do you think before the end of okay, do you think before the 2024 presidential election, Kamala Harris will become president?
Oh,
it's a fun bonus question.
That's a doozy of a question.
Yeah, that's why it's a bonus one. You don't have to think about it that hard. You just gotta tell me your intuition.
My intuition. I mean, I don't really feel comfortable giving much of a prediction on that.
Everybody does it. Come on.
I think Joe Biden can probably make it 4 years. I don't think he can make it much more. Is it possible that he could step down and Kamala could take control? Yes, it's possible. I guess so. My intuition, I guess, says he will probably make it 4 years and then maybe at that point, then he would step down and Kamala Harris would run in his place. But I don't feel like I know enough to say one way or the other. We could end up having President Kamala Harris, which again would not. I would not be jumping up and down. I would not be doing cartwheels if we get President Kamala Harris. Just like I'm not doing cartwheels after we've got President-elect Joe Biden. Well, and Kamala Harris does not inspire me any more than Joe Biden does.
I will say I'm going to take this deeply cynical take, and I'll say that either Biden's going to step down after a year because they want Kamala Harris president as they aim for the 2022 midterms, or he'll step down after the 2022 midterms because they thought that making her president earlier would actually hurt the Democrats. That's the cynical take. I don't think I'll die, but I think I'll step down. I'm going to lock in that answer. Okay. Well, I'm glad we have to chat about the election and our takeaways and also how we see things going. And we got to talk a little bit about more abstract things that are related to that. And I think we have a lot of stuff we need to cover because there's just so much stuff that we like to argue about. So I hope you guys enjoyed this somewhat debrief. It's to some extent kind of late because the election happened weeks ago, but it's not really over still. So I guess it's pretty timely. So I hope you guys enjoyed this commentary. You could find me on Twitter. I think I actually changed my Twitter handle since last time we recorded. I think it's Matthew T. Keck, at Matthew T. Keck. I think that's how you can find me on Twitter. And there I just say things that are very anarchist oriented every now and then, and like Tom Woods posts. That's pretty much it. And you can find us on YouTube to watch the video version of this podcast by searching The Anti-Philosopher and Beyond Talking Points. And then you can see how irate both of us get when we're muted and the other person is monologuing about our philosophical ideals, and we're just pontificating for minutes and minutes as the other person gets more upset. We tend to do that. And feel free to peruse the backlog. We have a lot of episodes that are still relevant, and they're going to be evergreen because like we talked about John Zerzan recently and anarcho-primitivism, and that's just a fun thing to talk about. And like that's always going to be relevant because it's not like Ted Kaczynski. Well, it was a recent event. So anarcho-primitivism is always something you can kind of revisit. So yeah, hope you guys check out some of that stuff, and I hope you enjoyed. And signing off, Matt and Matt.